I want to talk about a few more URL functions that might be helpful in the development. What are these URL functions? These are called URL helper functions. As the name suggests, it is used to help URL putting in a certain form. And we'll find this in the helpers.py program in the Flask module. Let me show you that. Let's go to the virtual environment. In the library under Python 3.12, we have this Flask. And inside of Flask, you'll find a helpers.py. And this is where you'll find all the URL functions. There are a lot of other URL functions. I'll be talking about only 2 or 3 helper functions which would use on a regular basis. I'll not go deeper into the other URL helper functions. The first one is add URL rule. And what it does is that we use it using the app object dot add URL rule. We provide the URL endpoint, then we mention the view function. So what is URL endpoint? You already know. The URL endpoint is the endpoint that we send from the client. In our case, that is Postman. And view function is the Python function that is used to handle that URL endpoint using an API. So basically, this is a replacement of @app.route. So instead of app.route, we can use this add URL rule function also to add various rules to the URL endpoint. And it is typically used when the application program is pretty large or pretty long, and we use this function to replace the @app.route decorator. Then we have redirect, and as the name suggests, redirect is used to redirect a particular endpoint to another API. For example, let's say one of the URL is not working and you want to redirect it to another very basic endpoint or basic API function. So you can use this redirect function to do that. And the final one is abort function, which is pretty intuitive, and the purpose is to abort or show an error method or error message, sorry. And there are various HTTP error messages that can be leveraged in the abort function. So these are the URL helper functions that I wanted to talk about: URL rule, redirect, and abort. This is a major topic, which is Python decorator. I'll not go into the details, but I want you to understand what Python decorator is, because you have been using Python decorator in all the functions or all the codes that you have written. Whenever you use that @app.route, that is a decorator. So whenever we mention @, we are essentially using a decorator. Now, what is the purpose of a decorator? The underlying concept of using Python decorator is that in Python, we can pass other functions as arguments to a function. Let's say we have function A and function B. And if we call function B, you can pass function A as an argument also. That is possible in Python. That's an advanced topic anyway, but we can do that. And based on this particular premise, Python decorators are created. So essentially, the purpose of decorators is to add features to an already existing function without changing the code of the defined function. So let's say you have a function and you do not want to touch the code at all, but you want to add more features or you want to add more functionalities to the existing function. So what you can do, you can use a decorator to do that. And that's what Flask is doing. We define plain and simple Python functions and we decorate them using app.run, which is a Flask method. And what Flask does is takes the function as an argument and changes it in such a way that it behaves as an API provider or an API service. So decorator is a function which takes a function as an argument or parameter and returns the modified function. Remember that decorator returns a function itself. It does not return variable. It does not return list, dictionary, or anything as such. It returns a function which is modified. So let's take a look at it pictorially. This is how we define decorator. Don't worry, I'll talk about these things in hands-on also and maybe pictorially in the next slide. So what we do is, let's say the get_data is the main Python function that you have created. Okay, and we want to add features or functionalities to this particular function, which is get_data. So The feature is that along with getting the data, we want to modify data also. So not only get data, you modify data. So if you find the record or if you find the row, then modify it. What we want to do is that we want to modify this function. But the problem is that we do not want to touch the function because it is very big and complex. And if we modify this particular function, there can be changes which might break the program in production. So do not want to do anything here. So instead of that, we want to take this function and modify it in such a way that nothing changes in the function itself. So for that, we define something called a decorator function. Def decorator underscore data, we pass an argument which has to be a function. And then we modify the data and then we return the mod data function. And this mod data is essentially modifying the functionality of this get underscore data. And this get underscore data is passed here as a function. But it does not stop there. To use this decorator, what we have to do is that we have to decorate this function with the decorator function. So, I mean, it might be confusing, but this is what @ does. So it says that @ decorator underscore data, which is actually the function. And it means whenever we execute this function like this get underscore data, the decorator data function would be executed rather than get underscore data. And get underscore data function would be passed in the decorator underscore data function. I hope it makes sense. So let's recap. Define get underscore data is our plain and simple Python function which receives a record. So it's an API, let's say. What it does is that it retrieves a record from a database. A business use case has come which wants this function to be changed so that if we get data, it has to modify the data in certain way, maybe 1 or 2 columns. But at the same time, you do not want to touch this function because this is a very complex function. So what you want to do is that you want to add functionality of modifying the function without changing the code within the function block. So for that, we define decorator data. We define one more function, decorator underscore data, and we pass an argument, and the argument is actually the function. We'll be passing a function here. This function is not a keyword. It can be A, B, C or anything. Essentially, we'll be passing a function here, not a variable. And inside of this function, we create another nested function, which is possible in Python, which modifies the data. And after modifying, it returns the function itself. So now we have this plain and simple get underscore data, and we have plain and simple function named decorator data, wherein it takes function as an argument and then it modifies the function. Actually, it will modify the function that we sent and then it returns the modified function. And then once it is done, we decorate this get underscore data function using @ symbol. So what we say, @decorator underscore data. So it means if we use this, then we call get underscore data function. Behind the scenes, decorator underscore data function would be called, and get underscore data function would be passed as an argument. All right, so that's what decorator is, and you can imagine that that's what Flask have been doing, and that's what we have been using so far. We use @app.route, and we pass some argument to it in app.route. Next, we define the function which will work as an API. So what that app.route does, it takes the function and modifies and makes it an API. And in case of Flask, we are not using a function or decorator function, we are using a decorator class. So the class is decorated rather than the function. I'm not going into the details of class decoration. Function decoration should be enough to understand what actually is happening or what Flask is doing behind the scenes. We'll not go into the implementation of Flask, how Flask is decorating, how it is creating an API, but I hope you get the gist. A little bit more pictorially, so this is the function. As you can see, I have highlighted return mod underscore data. I have highlighted @decorator underscore data, and then I have highlighted get underscore data. So what it means, the return mod data is returning address of a function. It is not calling the function. I'll tell you what this means. I'll show you this in hands-on. Then whenever we use @decorator underscore data, it is actually a call like this: get data equal to decorator in bracket get data, which means we are getting the output of this function in get data. and the output is also a function, right? Because it is returning a function, and you are passing get data as a variable or as an argument to the decorator function. It should be decorator underscore data, not decorator. Sorry, let me change that. So this is what it is. We are calling decorator underscore data. We are passing the get data function, and whatever this function is returning, which is actually a modified function address, and we are capturing it in get data, and then we are executing get data, which is basically decorator get data, right? This is what decorator does. Let's look at it using a hands-on, and we'll be using the familiar code that I have been showing you so far. Get customer detail and list customers, I guess we'll be using those two APIs only, but instead of API, I'll be using decorator. Now let's do some hands-on on URL and decorator. What we'll do is that we will use URL helper. We'll make some modifications in the function so that it can be handled using URL helper functions. And then we'll create a simple decorator, and then I hope you understand what app.route is actually doing. Okay, so let's go ahead and do the hands-on.